down. It's really a pleasure to have with us Elliot Ackerman to talk about his new book, The Fifth Act. And so I thought I'd tell you a bit about Elliot. It's really a delight for me to introduce him. It says here in the bio that Elliot Ackerman is a New York Times bestselling author, and that's true. And he writes about war, which is what many of us study. And he writes about war and all of its implications. He's done this both in novels, and I really recommend his novels. And if you want to see it at the ground level, I think one of the ones that really hit me was Green on Blue. But Dark at the Crossing and others are really good. And he also studies and writes about war through his memoirs. And Places and Names is the first one. That's on Iraq mainly.
And Syria.
And Syria, yeah. And this one, The Fifth Act, is of course on Afghanistan. So those are his books, and they, by the way, win awards and are nominated for lots of important awards. He's a former White House fellow, not an easy thing to be. He's a Marine, and since there's no such thing as an ex-Marine, he's a former Marine.
Also not an easy thing to be.
But he's a former Marine that served 5 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. And now, the most important thing about it, Mauled, 2003, yeah, Field of Study. You bet. Okay. So, Elliot, I've thought about and I've read the Fifth Act, and I have 5 questions for you. But I thought before I ask you my questions, and we have questions from the audience, that if you could take a little time to tell them what the Fifth Act is about, because I'm sure many of them haven't had a chance to read it, but I'm sure after they hear this, they're going to read it. So go ahead.
Thanks, Dick, and thanks so much for hosting me here. I mean, it's obviously really great to be back at Fletcher on home turf. And so as I sitting here right now, part of me feels like maybe I wrote the Fifth Act, so I would come here and you would ask me 5 questions. So, the book is about Afghanistan and the end of Afghanistan, and it wasn't really actually a book that I was planning to write. So as the situation was deteriorating in August of 2021, I got signed up by my publisher to write the book very, very quickly. And its sort of inception as an idea, these 5 acts, was a friend of mine who is an editor and has a pretty popular Substack, reached out to me like August 15th as everything was happening and said, Elliot, I'm putting together 3 or 4 people for my Substack to write 500-word short essays on the situation in Afghanistan. Would you contribute? And candidly, I was upset. Like I'm sure many of you were watching what was happening. I didn't really feel like writing about it. I said, what do you even want me to write? And how much room would I have? And she said, well, you'd have, she said, people don't really understand what's going on. They haven't been paying attention. And maybe if in 500 words, you could just sort of summarize what's gone on in Afghanistan the last 20 years. Yeah, no big deal. I was like, well, I don't know if I could do that. I mean, that's kind of a lot. And she said, well, people are watching and they just know it's a tragedy and they can't understand it. And her use of that word tragedy allowed me to write this short piece, but allowed me at least to start putting a framework, at least, one framework around what had happened in Afghanistan. Because as many of you probably know, if you look at classic dramatic structures, I mean, from Shakespeare back to the ancients, tragedies are typically told in 5 acts. So the book is a book that talks about the politics of the war in Afghanistan and that type of a 5-act structure. So the first act is President Bush, second act is President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, and the 5th act, kind of the denouement, is the Taliban. So the book does, sort of write about the politics of the war across that 5-act structure. And then again, probably like many of you, after August 15th and those 2 pretty intense weeks of the American withdrawal, like anyone who had ties to Afghanistan, whether they served in uniform, worked there as a journalist, were Afghans living in America themselves or activists, my entire network lit up with people, who needed help, who were either in the United States trying to get family members out, who were in Afghanistan, and many people I didn't know. So I kind of quickly found myself part of one of these, it's been called the digital Dunkirk, this sort of crowdsourced evacuation, that in many respects was unlike anything we had ever seen. I mean, there was much speculation in the lead up to our withdrawal from Afghanistan was, is this going to be as bad as Saigon? No, it won't be as bad as Saigon. I would argue it was much worse. One of the reasons it was so much worse with Saigon is, we've never been able to see and hear the collapse the way we could over messages, WhatsApp, Signal, social media. Everyone was immediately connected as this was happening. So I was involved in a number of those efforts. And the book, so along with the 5 political acts of the book, I document 5 set piece evacuations that I was involved in, some of which were successful and some of which weren't. And so I think the reader, gets to see how those were working at that time, and involved me working with many colleagues of mine who were journalists, many colleagues of mine who were active military, former military, and in the intelligence services. And then sort of the last sort of thread of the book is, as everyone was doing this summer, kind of, I think, underpinning so much of those efforts, and maybe not explicitly stated all the time, but implicit, was this idea, particularly for those of us who served in the military, is that, we don't leave our people behind. Like, we've all learned that. That is an ideal that we try to live up to. It can often be very, very complicated. And that's not an ideal that is unique in any ways to the US military. I mean, it is really an ideal that is as old as war itself. I mean, if you go all the way back to, to the Iliad, one of the final scenes of the Iliad is after Achilles kills Hector in front of the gates of Troy. He drags Hector's body back to his camp. And you see King Priam, king of the Trojans, sneaks into Achilles' camp. And as Homer's tale is ending, King Priam is basically begging for the body of his son to Achilles. Again, we don't leave anybody behind. So underpinning all of these efforts, that idea of we don't leave anyone behind. And for me, it was dredging up a lot of memories of my own time in Afghanistan, and particularly an ambush that I was involved in 2008. Where one of my teammates was killed, and we were, pretty badly beat up in this ambush. We had a lot of our own wounded and a lot of our vehicles destroyed, and we struggled to go back and get his body and make good on that ideal. And so I was, throughout that summer, really thinking about it, dredged up candidly a lot of old memories for me, and whether or not in that instant I had lived up to the ideal, and whether or not I would be able to live up to it again in the summer of 2021. So those sort of 3 threads, the political, the kind of play-by-play of the evacuation, and this deeper memoiristic thread, kind of are overlaid on one another and become the book. And I also write a bit about my family, because we happen to be on family holiday as this was all happening, which was sort of extremely surreal as well. So
in Italy.
In Italy, yeah.
So one of the themes of your book is lack of U.S. commitment, and the way you use plywood. I love the way that you use that. By plywood, what Elliot would say is that whenever the U.S. built a base, it built it in plywood. It didn't build it with brick and mortar, suggesting it's only temporary. Plywood's a temporary place to stay. But the U.S. committed 20 years to Afghanistan, a lot of blood, and a lot of treasure, a lot of money. So how's that square with your theme of lack of commitment? So that would, and then there's a second part to this is, did the U.S. create a dependency in those 20 years that led the, you write that we would say in 2 years we're leaving, and 2 years we're leaving. And did the Afghans think they'll never leave? They're always going to be here for us.
Well, one of the reasons I like writing about war is because the narratives that we apply to war are so critically important. So that the symbolism of the plywood. I mean, I think anyone who's served in Afghanistan or spent time on a U.S. military base can attest to the fact you walk around, it's sort of remarkable the amount of plywood that exists. Everything is built in plywood. I served at some bases that were built where Russians had their bases, and I assure you their bases were not made out of plywood. They were made out of very durable stuff. So it speaks to a certain psychology. What is the psychology that a country is bringing to a war? And I think there's an irony that exists around the U.S. psychology. So again, the Soviets went to Afghanistan. They built out of concrete, and they stayed, less than half the time that we stayed. If we can look at our own Vietnam War, if you look at the book A Bright Shining Lie, which is all about John Paul Vann, a U.S. military officer and later State Department officer who really served the duration of that war. He famously said the problem with Vietnam wasn't that we fought a 7-year war, it was that we fought 7 one-year wars. And I think you can make a similar epitaph on the American experience in Afghanistan. We didn't fight a 20-year war, we fought 21-year wars. And so the irony here, particularly in Afghanistan, and I hope is a lesson we take forward, is it's not just the time commitment, it's the psychology that you bring to the time commitment. So if you have a short-term psychology, you can still fight a very long-term war. Like, I'm not going to get up here and say 20 years isn't a long time to fight a war. That's a really long time to fight a war. But how does a person like wind up fighting a 20-year war? It's sort of like that old metaphor, how do you eat a wheel of cheese? One bite at a time. How do you fight a 20-year war? 1 year at a time. Or if you're a Marine, 6 months at a time. And so because there was always that short-term mentality, I think the corollary to it is often also meant for the Afghans that there was always this sense, and if you look at anywhere on that 20-year timeline, we were always sort of 1 foot out of the door, within 18 to 24 months, the Americans were leaving. You can go all the way back to 2001, the first sort of offer, the invasion of Iraq. We, pull so many of our resources into Iraq. And that under-resourcing of the Afghan war goes on until really 2008 and 2009, when Obama comes in and surges to Afghanistan. Finally, Afghanistan is again given the resources that we might need to win this war. But in the exact same speech when Obama announces the surge, he announces the withdrawal date. I mean, I was in Afghanistan when that happened, and I will just attest, we walked out the gate the next day, and and you're talking to the local power brokers, and you're giving them the hard sell of why you need to support the Afghan government. Your future lies with the Afghan government in Kabul. We're going to help you get there. And they look at you and they're like, okay, but I watch CNN. Your president just said you're leaving in 2014. And yeah, maybe that's 5 years away, but the Taliban shadow governor down the road who comes here when you're not here, he's staying. I mean, he's not going anywhere. And so you're immediately undercutting yourself. So it doesn't matter how many resources you pour into Afghanistan, that psychology, becomes a real problem. And I mean, just the last thing that you stick, and then with regards to how that affects our Afghan partners, listen, there's plenty of blame to go around for the dysfunction that existed in Afghanistan. We're to blame. Many of our Afghan partners are to blame. Why many never saw the government in Kabul as legitimate, but presenting ourselves to them as though we're constantly about to leave and that we weren't, committed to a certain end state, I don't think helped us create the types of legitimacy that we would need for our partners in Afghanistan. And I think in some ways caused many Afghans to understandably hedge when when the message we were sending them is, we're going to be gone in 24 months. So I hope you and your family will be fine when we leave. And at the end, and I'll just finish by saying, and moving forward now, I think the United States as partners have done ourselves great harm because you have those images, those crushing images of the airport in Kabul, and those will stay with us as we try to make a case for partnership around the world in the future.
Yeah. The reason I asked it about, what did the Afghans think? So when I was a young guy, I knew very well 2 of the station chiefs that were in Saigon. And one used to always tell me that they used to tell the Vietnamese, we're not going to be here forever. You got to understand that. It's a variation on the president announcing we're not going to be there forever. But they never believed it. He said they would always look at me and they would go. This guy's name was Ted Shackley. He's, by the way, the most highly decorated DO officer in the Cold War. And he said, they would say, oh, yes, we understand. But I'd look them in the eye and they'd be telling me, you're not telling the truth. You'll always be here. And that's why I wanted to see the parallel.
Well, I mean,
which obviously there isn't.
Well,
So-
I mean, and first of all, I would never purport to sit up here and speak for all Afghans and what
No,
they
of
think.
course.
But there is a significant group of Afghans who knew we wouldn't always be there, and that's the Taliban. I mean, they're not stupid. The sort of the great truism when I served Afghanistan was, the Americans might have the watches, but the Taliban have the time.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I would argue that we couldn't get to, that we failed in Afghanistan was, the Afghan government and we, NATO and the Americans were never able to convince a truly critical mass of Afghans that we had both the watches and the time.
Yeah.
And there might have been a window after 2001 when we could have done that. But we took our eye off the ball. And I would just like, a last point too, which is a sort of a narrative that I have found a little bit frustrating, particularly, after our withdrawal, is this one that, well, because the United States was helping the Afghan government, it just showed that the Afghan government was really an illegitimate government, because when we left, they just collapsed. It's like, yeah, to me, that's always seemed a little bit rich, because like if the Pakistanis had just suddenly pulled all support from the Taliban and the Taliban had to stand on their own, the Taliban would have collapsed.
Yep.
So, I mean, you have to know the type of war you're in. It was war by proxy. And at the end of the day, we didn't have the staying power.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, it's so interesting to think about these parallels of commitment. The Taliban were in it for the long haul. And I mentioned in the Royal Force class the other day that they used to find North Vietnamese soldiers who came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and were killed. They'd find tattoo on them said, "Born in the North will die in the South."
That's right.
Yeah.
That's in your book.
It is. It is. Well, I grew up in the Vietnam War era, and it generated tremendous protest. I mean, and the commitment was not, nearly as big and as long-term as this commitment. And yet, note, many Americans didn't even know there was a war. There's a war going on. Really? Didn't know that. So I'd like you to explain to them, why that was, even in the information age. When we know, when someone sneezes down the block, there's a tweet on it. And yet there was no understanding that there was a war going on by 48%.
Yeah, that's sort of remarkable. So in so we're about to be at the midterms. So in 2018, between the midterms, Rasmussen was doing its polling to sort of find out what issues the American people care about. When they polled about Afghanistan, they asked, how does this stack in your priority of issues? And I'm sure it won't surprise anyone here that it wasn't a top issue in, September of 2018. This is before the negotiations had really kicked off in the Trump administration. But 48% of Americans, it wasn't that it wasn't a priority issue for them. They didn't even know if the war was still going on. They just couldn't say. They didn't know if there was a war going on there anymore. So how do we, again, this question of how do we wind up fighting a 20-year war? I mean, look, if you look at every war that America has fought since the revolution, we have needed a construct to sustain the war. And I mean that broadly speaking in two ways. How do you sustain the war in terms of blood and in terms of treasure, right? Who's going to fight it? How are you going to pay for it? So, if we look at the American Civil War, the first ever draft in this country is to provide troops for the US Civil War, as is the first ever income tax. So that was the structure for our Civil War. The Second World War, we see a national mobilization, war bond drives. As you mentioned, Vietnam is characterized by a very unpopular draft that leads to an anti-war movement that ends the war, or at least contributes to ending the war. Yep. So 9/11 happens. America is again going to war, so we need a construct to sustain our wars. So how do we do that? Well, the blood comes from our all-volunteer military, and the treasure comes from deficit spending. And so the result of that is that the American people are anesthetized to the costs of war. It doesn't mean that we're bad people, but at the end of the day, we're not asked to do anything. And so the war kind of takes up its mantle just sort of in the background of American life. And I think it's dangerous for a couple of reasons. I think it's dangerous, A, because it gives politicians of both parties an extremely long leash politically with which to wage war, because they're not held accountable for the cost of that war. And so we see the war drag on for 20 years. But I would argue right now too, and in the book, I do turn a little bit domestically, that it has created a civil military divide that's as wide as any that we have known in modern times. And so we have a significant chunk of just Americans who are they're not literate in the US military. And so we have now outsourced our defense to a subculture of American society. And this aligns with trends that we see of the atomization of American society anyways. But I would argue if you just crack open a history book, it's pretty dangerous when you start atomizing our national defense. And so if you look back from Caesar's Rome to Napoleon's France, anytime you couple extremely dysfunctional domestic politics with a very large standing military that's well armed and a huge divide between the two, it is not good for democracy. And that is the exact position that we're in right now. And I would argue particularly as we go from contested election to contested election with the levels of contestation escalating each time. So the analogy I use in the book is that us having these contested elections as a nation is we're sort of like a drunk driver. So the drunk driver goes to the bar, right, or he and she, they knock back a few drinks, then they get in their car and they drive home. And you know what? The first few times, they actually manage to get home okay, and they convince themselves, well, it's all right, it ended our way last time. But it's always the third, the fourth, the fifth time. That's when the drunk driver wraps their car around a telephone pole. And I feel like, each presidential election now that we're going to, it's like we're going to the bar, we're getting completely hammered drunk, and we're trying to find our way home. And that, there are a number of, telephone poles we can talk about on our way home, but our US military is one of them. And it's not because the US military breaks, Republican or Democrat, but it's because, and again, it's important. And this is something I actually learned here as a student with one of our military fellows, who, when I asked him many years ago if he had voted, told me, oh, I don't vote. And explained to me the reason he didn't. I mean, I'm saying I agree with that, but he said, I don't vote because I don't vote for who's in my chain of command. And I talk about, civilian literacy about the military. I think most civilians are not aware that, when you wear the uniform on active duty, your relationship to the president is fundamentally different than a civilian's. The authority of the orders from which you obey come from the credibility and the legitimacy of a president. And we keep flirting and playing with these ideas of whether or not the president is or is not legitimate. And that can put US military members in a very dangerous position, particularly around violence in an election. But I would, why am I writing about that in a book about Afghanistan? Because we've arrived at that military divide, because we now have a US military that's not only been at war for 20 years, but one that just lost a war. Yeah. And I don't think most Americans realize the psychological cost of losing a war like Afghanistan obviously for Afghans, but also for the veterans who fought there.
On this point of who's in the Army or who's in the military, we had the commandant of the Army War College here yesterday, and I'm going to ask Rocky to help me remember this. He said that he gave the percentage of, what was it? 23% of, no, not that. How many come from military families? 78% of new recruits, thank you. 78% of new recruits come from military families. You're creating a caste.
Well, and what's so dangerous about that is, again, and we look back to history. If you look at societies, or dare I say, empires that are in decline, one of the things that they always do is they outsource the national defense. And so, probably the people who did this most famously were the Romans. They outsourced the national defense to the provinces of Rome, and that was, that contributes significantly to their eventual demise. And I would argue that in the United States, we are similarly outsourcing the national defense. Now, we're not doing it to, the provinces per se, but we're again doing it to this subcaste of Americans. And so one of the things, as Afghanistan was ending, that was just so glaringly obvious was, I'm in these chat rooms and organizing with people at the airport and this and that. I was like, we all know each other. Like, you know, there were 2 Marine battalions at Kabul International Airport. One of the battalion commanders, you know, he and I went through Quantico together when we were 23 years old. I called him immediately. Hey, man, you know, there were a group of Afghan CIA paramilitaries at the airport. The head of that paramilitary unit and I, we went through commando training together when I was 23. Like, you know, and journalists, everybody knew each other, but nobody knew us. And it was really stark. And that is dangerous. This, you know, in a healthy society, this would have been integrated across, this experience would have been integrated across the society, and it's not. And I worry that there's just not enough awareness of that.
I found that such an interesting point in your book. I wanted to go to ending the war, and you brought up a term I'm well versed with, decent interval.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's from
Your class.
when I was growing up. Decent interval. And am I going too far to say that you're kind of lamenting that there wasn't a decent interval? But I lived through a decent interval as a young guy, and it's a sham. There's no such thing as a decent interval.
I'm not lamenting that it wasn't a decent interval. I think in the book, I make my way as a novelist, and I think as a novelist, you have to be empathetic. So I was feeling a great deal of frustration with the administration as it was ending. So one has to ask yourself, okay, like, I don't believe these are horrible people who are trying to do, you know, vindictive things to the Afghan people. It's like, what was their logic of this plan? Like, so I do understand like the logic. I think if, you know, we were talking in May of 2021, you know, what's the plan here? You know, I do think it was a very kind of realpolitik plan. It was, listen, we're going to pull everybody out of Afghanistan. We've built up enough resources there that there will be a decent interval. So, you know, I'm sure everyone here is taking the role of force on. So that's the interval from when there's the collapse of the government to you know, after we pull out to when there's the collapse. So there'll be a decent interval, and that could be, you know, in Vietnam it was 3 years basically, and you know, in Afghanistan the first time was a couple of years. You know, even if it was 6 months or 3 months, the decent interval will give the Americans, give the administration the ability to say, hey, listen, it didn't happen on our watch. We got our people out, and that will make this so it's not such a political viability, because we also know the American people don't really care about Afghanistan. They do care about being embarrassed and seeing the images that they saw in August, and that's why it resonated so much. So when the administration didn't get its decent interval, there was no contingency plan for that. That they had not planned for. That was not at the front of their mind. They were counting on the decent interval. And once the decent interval didn't show up, that's when you saw a complete bedlam. And so I think, you know, when we look, and it's a consistent theme throughout sort of the, I would call it the terror wars, is the darkest moments come when there is a worst case contingency plan that seems sort of obvious, but that just no one plans for. So I'll go back to Iraq briefly. You know, I always felt that the great crime of the Iraq war, and you know, you guys can heckle me from the crowd if you disagree, wasn't the weapons of mass destruction. I always said, I remember being in DC in 2001 and 2, and like everybody thought he had them, and he was trying to convince people that he had them. To me, the thing that was so negligent to the point of being criminally negligent was the plan was we were going to invade Iraq and we'll be greeted as liberators. This is going to be like the movie. This is going to be like the TV series Band of Brothers. Like Steven Spielberg is going to direct. They'll be kissing us and flowers. And it's like, okay, maybe, but what if that doesn't happen? What do you mean it's not going to happen? Of course it's going to happen. What if there's an insurgency? And it didn't take a genius to realize there could be an insurgency in Iraq, and there was, but no one had planned for it in the administration. Yeah. And just like with Afghanistan, the hubris is on the other side. It doesn't take a genius to be like, well, you know, like this could all collapse. I mean, it's you know, this, and no one had planned for what do we do if there's no decent interval.
Yeah. One of the themes is, as you said earlier, no one's left behind. But a lot of people were left behind. And that was true. I'm using this Vietnam parallel, you know, that was true in the Vietnam case as well. So is your story about those rescued, you know, or is it about those left behind? And the mantra, our mantra, we don't leave people behind, it's kind of false. We left the Vietnamese behind to the re-education camps and all the horror of that. And we're leaving the Afghans behind to the horrors of the Taliban, who are the same, look like the same ones that were there earlier.
Yep.
You know, we had one of our former graduates who's quite illustrious, who was asked to write, he said he was going to write a book on the new Taliban. And we convinced him he needed to put a question mark after that.
It's good at it. Well, I said, you know, this idea of we don't leave anyone behind, it's an ideal,
Yeah.
right? That's, I mean, it's actually a specific word, an ideal. By
Yeah.
definition, an ideal is can be neither true nor false. An ideal is a marker that you put on a wall and you reach for it and you hope that you touch it. And guess what? Many of the times you don't touch it and you fail to get there. So it's an ideal. You hope that you don't leave people behind. And again, in the book, I write about this ambush and what it meant for me to, get because I wanted to show how difficult it is to live up to that ideal at times where, I had a teammate of mine who he was dead and he was in the kill zone of an ambush. And every single one of our vehicles was towing another vehicle. And I was ordered by a senior commander of mine who I didn't think was the greatest commander, that you guys got to go back in there and you got to get out his body. And I knew that someone was going to at least get badly hurt. Probably a couple of us were going to get killed if we tried to do this. And so how do you tell him, like, we can't do this? And how does that, project out? And I'll spare you the play-by-play of everything that happened. But eventually one of our sister teams was able to get his body out. But we, his teammates, were not the ones who were able to do it. And I know that certainly weighed on me, and I think weighed on a few of the rest of us. That's a time when, there's the marker on the wall. We reached up and we jumped and we tried to touch it and we couldn't quite get there. So you don't always get there. Leave no one behind is a platitude at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Just because something's a platitude doesn't mean it's false. But it does mean it's a platitude. And oftentimes we go to war with platitudes in our mouth, and platitudes are usually simple. They're 3 or 4 words. And when you come back from war, you don't have 3 or 4 words. You've got, paragraphs and books in your mouth because the reality is much more complicated.
Yeah. And I think about this in terms of the what it says about the country and the United States as an ally, and we pay a big price when we abandon people in terms of our reputation. Hey, I have one last question, and then we'll ask for many questions that you're probably going to get from all of them. The parallels with Vietnam are for me, every line I read, I'm thinking back to Vietnam. And this isn't really a question, it's just an observation. As I was watching those images from the airport, and the airplanes taking off and some guy falling out of the wheel well at, however high he was. And I could see I saw looming over the airport, the embassy. I mean, the images for me were so consistent. And even in the embassy case, you had helicopters where people fell off of the skids of the helicopters. The parallels are really meaningful. And I just want to say that I think you knitted those together, at least for someone who, studied the Vietnam War until he had another war to study, which was Iraq.
Sure. I'll just say on that, I grew up in sort of the shadow of the Vietnam War. That was, as a little boy, that was the one that had just happened. And I was a child who was always had an innate fascination with the military. I used to actually lug around a huge illustrated history of the Vietnam War, which I still have. When I was like 6 and 7 years old, I was just sort of fascinated by it. And then serving in the Marine Corps and kind of coming up, I've gotten to know many of the Vietnam guys very well, and many of them very generous to my generation and, mentored us along the way. I always felt for years that there was this just sort of like a little bit of a remove that existed between, my generation and the Vietnam guys. And I kind of chalked they were like a little, I always they were like a little suspicious of us. And I always felt that suspicion was sort of, they're like, yeah, okay, we went to Vietnam, but it was either because we got drafted or we knew we were going to get drafted. And what's wrong with you guys? You guys go back 4, 5, 6, 7 times. They didn't totally get us. Mm-hmm. And then frankly, there was this part of them that I always felt with the Vietnam guys was that they were a little bit more bitter than we were. There was a real hardness there. And I, for years, I was like, well, that sense of disillusionment I feel that they have that our generation doesn't have is, maybe like there were children in the 1950s. I'm a kid of the 80s and the 90s. I watched violent movies and played violent video games. So I didn't have as many illusions, so I couldn't be disillusioned the way they were. For years, I sort of equated that slight bit of reserve I felt from the Vietnam guys to those two things.
I'll add a third,
What's that?
the anti-war movement.
Maybe the anti-war movement.
You didn't have
I
that.
didn't have that.
And that embittered many veterans.
Well, the point I would make is that when this ended in Afghanistan the way that it ended, I realized I had been completely wrong about the Vietnam guys. And I suddenly understood them in a way, and I understood that remove and what it had been. And to me, what that remove was the difference between us was they knew how it ended and we didn't yet. They knew how this was going to end for us. And it wasn't actually like distance or reserve. It was actually sort of a little bit of like, frankly, pity. Like they're like, hey kid, like you don't know what's going to happen at the end of the day here. And I do, because I lived through it. And at the back end of this, I have sort of had conversations with those guys and, that have been very meaningful to me as they've sort of, said like, yeah, this is how it ends. It took us 7 years, it took you 20. And so that, I didn't think I could learn something new, but I was surprised to have been wrong for so long.
Wow. Awesome. So we're supposed to have a microphone somewhere. Do we have a mic? Where is it? Oh, okay, Rocky, you have to go to the microphone. Okay. And anyone who has a question, you got to go to the microphone.
Well, Elliot, thanks. Welcome. My question is one about the Afghanistan withdrawal, or didn't. I've been mystified that not a single senior person in the administration has been held accountable for the Afghanistan withdrawal. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, given your record of service and as somebody who looks at the political dysfunction in Washington and tries to think of solutions, because I know you try to do that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think, listen, I think the fact that no one has been held, accountable per se for the Afghan withdrawal is maybe indicative of the fact that we have a national security state in the United States that is ossified. So I think that's, I love the U.S. Civil War, and I was actually, rewatching some of the Ken Burns. And one of the things that just struck me is like, good Lord, they used to cycle through generals quickly back then. But that to that point, when we talk about accountability, is I don't think, with this one, you laid it. I don't think there's some general that you need to lay this at the feet of. And I think or Jake Sullivan, or candidly, I think this is President Biden. I mean, this is from the top. So I think one of the things that's tough is, who are you going to fire? And the reality is the person driving this train was the president himself. And so, you can't fire the president, and he'll either reap the consequences, at an election, or he won't. So, but I do think the fact that we don't see more of a turnover, that type of professional accountability at senior leadership, probably is a problem or something that we need to visit. But I think specific to the end of Afghanistan, that one is at the feet of the president, for better or worse. Thank you.
Risa, tell them who you are.
My name is Risa Sobchak. I'm a first-year PhD student, and I'm a retired Army officer. I actually worked in the Personal Recovery Office as the program director for the Army's Personal Recovery, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape program for 4 years. So we dealt in the issue of no one left behind pretty consistently. And it's a very small, tight-knit community across the agencies and joints. So we worked with FBI, State Department, the POW MIA office. And I was consistently disappointed in that job on how really it seemed to me that no one kind of outside of our community cared about the POWs, MIAs that were contractors and not in uniform. There was very little pressure or a sense of a heightened awareness of getting, finding conclusion on the contractor or American civilian issues. The focus was always on those in uniform. And then I also worked in the attempt to help Afghans get out of the country in a lot of different ways. And I was constantly kind of expressing to my civilian friends why people in uniform cared so much about our Afghan allies because they really couldn't understand why it was so important to get Afghans that we worked with out. So I guess my conclusion is the whole no one left behind from a psychological perspective is that Americans see that it only applies to people in uniform, not even to Americans who are missing, who are not in uniform. And what is your opinion on that?
I think we should take them. I mean, I think it's worth, the POW MIA flag flies all over the place in this country. It's incredibly recognizable, and that movement was extremely important at the time that it was, developed. But the spirit that inspired that movement is the spirit that I wish we could see applied to our Afghan allies. I mean, these people, they might not have blue passports, but these people are American heroes who fought alongside us, and they deserve to be acknowledged as such, who bled alongside us and fought for the ideals that we purport to represent. So we've seen the amount of, and you've seen, I'm sure, the amount of resources that the United States will apply to, let's say, recover the remains of a downed flyer in the Pacific 75 years after he was killed. But at the same time, we'll have an Afghan with his family who, it's well documented, fought with our troops, saved the lives of Americans, and they're waiting in line for a visa and hiding in Kabul, and we really don't think about it. And to me, I bet if you were to talk to that World War II pilot and explain things to him, he'd be like, don't worry about me. I can stay down here for a few more years once you help that Afghan pilot. So I hope that we could see a similar type of awareness about what our Afghan allies have done for us. That is comparable to the POW MIA movement. And I would just bring this up in one very specific thing. This book came out in August. I've been talking about it. There was a sense around the 1 year that people were going to kind of talk about this again. This is an issue now that I think is going to recede out of our national consciousness because people are like, well, what can you do? It ended the way it ended. Maybe nothing could have been done and now it's over. Like, it's not over. Like, you have 80,000 Afghans thereabouts who are in the United States right now, who are here under humanitarian parole. They can only work as an exemption to that parole. Their status is not settled. So there is bicameral legislation in Congress right now, the Afghan Adjustment Act, that would get them green cards and get them on a pathway to citizenship. It looks unlikely that that is going to pass, which is a staggering indictment of our country.
Hey, sir, great talk. Thanks for being here today. I just had a quick comment on the Vietnam veteran disconnect you were discussing. Perhaps some of that could be from the level of reverence that veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan receive in society today. I know there's a sense of almost hubris or entitlement that comes with that from some vets. And I think maybe Vietnam veterans look at that as, wow, I'm glad you didn't endure what our generation had to, but also you have no idea how bad it could be. Right. And so perhaps some of that goes under the radar. But a question about 2034. So it's about 2 years since that's been published. Again, hubris, stumbling into nuclear conflict was one of the messages of that, or a warning of doing that. A lot's happened in 2 years. So what are your thoughts on how people are still responding to that? As any of those messages you think been taken away?
Sure. Well, that's a book that's very much rooted in Fletcher because all of the smartest characters went to the Fletcher school and making critical decisions. Yes. Thank you. And it's also one rooted in the naval service because all of the good guys are Marines or Navy officers. And the one arch-villain went to West Point. So I feel like we got all that right. That book was actually, when we wrote it, was not supposed to be, the spirit of the book that we were aligned was like, hey, we're not trying to predict anything here. This isn't a work of prediction. It's a work of speculation. And we wanted to take a reader kind of up an escalatory ladder. So something that's unimaginable becomes unimaginable, which is basically a nuclear war at sea, China and the United States fully engaged with one another. What are the incremental steps that you get there? So sort of like the Guns of August, but 100+ years in the future. So I think right now, as we look at what's going on in Ukraine with the Russians, I like to think the book is relevant because we're playing, we're kind of looking at that calculus again, like what are the actions that could lead us up a similar escalatory ladder? And we were talking about it a little bit. It's amazing to think that we're sitting here in the year 2022 and we're talking about, will they or won't they drop tactical nukes in Ukraine, and what will we or won't we do? And open up any website, you can see all the opinion pieces about that. And that should terrify all of us, particularly because we still have all the nuclear weapons, but we don't exist in a world that's a bipolar world, Americans and Soviets that have all of the deterrent regimes that we had during the Cold War. So it's a much more three-dimensional world right now we're living in, which makes that escalatory ladder more dangerous. So 2034 is just sort of, one iteration of what it would look like to go up that ladder, but there are infinite varieties of how it can play out.
Really great to have you, Elliot, here back on campus. You mentioned about the psychological loss of American soldiers, of the United States in general, in Afghanistan or before. I wonder how important it is for you, for American soldiers, for anyone who's been committed in terms of wars abroad. The victory now in Ukraine, would that change things, even though there is no direct engagement of US soldiers, but the United States is committed? So how do you think that would mean for the American people?
Sure. I think that it's, I think it is important to put Afghanistan and Ukraine in conversation with one another, and we don't seem to be doing that. I think, you can drop a plumb line from what happened in August of 2021 to what happened to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. I'm not saying that one is completely causative, but clearly Putin is watching what's happening in Kabul as he's deciding whether or not he's going to invade Ukraine. He's weighing what the what the NATO response would be, and he sees a pretty feckless NATO response in Afghanistan. He then invades Ukraine, and it's dizzying that I would argue within 6 months of what I would consider one of NATO's darkest hours, we see probably one of its brightest moments, which is the way the alliance overperforms in Ukraine. But again, I think it's important to put these in conversation with one another, because one of the reasons the United States ostensibly got out of Afghanistan that President Biden gave was that we've been fixated on our wars on terror too long. We're entering an age of great power competition, and we need to refocus our assets accordingly. And actually, I completely agree with that. There's been a huge opportunity cost of being fixated on these terror wars. But if we talk about that with regards to Ukraine, why did Ukraine matter so much? And for all of the humanitarian reasons it matters. But as one of the subtexts of Ukraine is, had the Russians just swept through Ukraine and raised the flag over Kiev and there'd been no meaningful Ukrainian resistance, what would we all be talking about right now? We'd be talking about Taiwan. We'd be talking in more breathless terms about the rise of an authoritarian axis that is Russia, China, Iran, and it'd be a much darker world. So thank God Ukraine held, and the Ukrainians have been very quick. They tell about stories about war. They tell a story that this is a world war. So, but let's talk about that. So Ukraine matters in some ways because of China, and we are repivoting to great power competition around the world. Well, if we're trying to imagine what it would look like to go to war with China, one of the huge disadvantages we have if there were a Chinese incursion into Taiwan is we would be fighting that war across the Pacific Ocean, relying on our partners, while the Chinese would be fighting it in their backyard. Wouldn't it be nice for the United States if we had, I don't know, say, some strategic air bases in a Central Asian country that has a border with China? I mean, a very, very small border, but a border nonetheless. And we forfeited all of those in Afghanistan. So again, when it comes to how Afghanistan ended, I would say, there is obviously the morality of how we pulled out, the human cost of how we pulled out. But if you're just talking great power politics, we could have probably maintained a foothold in Afghanistan between 7,000 to 10,000 NATO troops. I would argue probably somewhat indefinitely. And if we're talking great power competition, we ever have to go to war with China, it would probably be nice to be in Afghanistan. It's, it's the great game there for a reason. So I don't know if that answers your question.
General Dunford made the same point Tuesday night about we could have stayed in Afghanistan. He had a little bit higher number, but exactly the same point.
Yeah, just real politics. You want to be real politic.
That's
yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. Matt Diska, Marine Fellow and 1-year MA. I was curious if you could share your idea for a war memorial that encompasses all U.S. conflicts versus the individual ones that are currently in DC in the context of civil-military relations and the atomization of American culture.
Oh, sure. So some of you may or may not be aware, last year, Congress authorized the Global War on Terrorism Memorial, which is sort of an interesting prospect because the global war on terrorism is still ongoing. It hasn't ended. So in order to pass that act, they had to get exemptions to the statutes that say you cannot create, that 5 years has to pass from the end of the war to the creation of a memorial. So I've been interested in thinking about that because it begs the question of how do you create a war memorial to a war that hasn't finished yet? So I did some reading. I think many people aren't aware that the National Mall, the first war memorial on the National Mall was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There were no war memorials on the mall before. There were memorials to people and Grant and other heroes, but not to war. So in thinking about how do you create and so there's been a controversy of should the National Mall just become littered with our war memorials and almost feel like a national graveyard? So the idea I sort of like, and I write about in the book, is I would sort of like if we got rid of all the war memorials and consolidated them into one American war memorial. And one of the things that happens when you try to build a war memorial, as we're seeing with the global war on terrorism one, is that if it obstructs any other memorial's line of sight, it becomes very controversial. So I'm like, well, let's not build it up. We should build down, because the one thing you learn how to do in the military is how to dig. And so my vision of an American war memorial would be sort of like it'd be like something out of Dante. Think like almost like a reverse Guggenheim museum. And we would just dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the earth. And we would list the names of every American killed in all the wars, all the way back to Crispus Attucks, who was killed in the Boston Massacre, a free black man. Go all the way down to our most recent war. Then at the bottom of the American War Memorial, there would be two things. There would be basically a shovel, because it'd be incompleted, so you can keep on digging. So we just keep adding the names. And then there would be a desk and a chair with a pen on it. We would also pass legislation that anytime the president, whether he or she signed the deployment order, they would have to do it from that desk and that pen, walking past all of the costs for America's wars. So that's sort of my American War Memorial idea. We'll see if it ever goes anywhere.
Hi, my name's Diana Hartford. I'm a first semester MALD. Thank you so much for doing this. Two questions. The first one I hope is very quick and easy. You spoke about the civil military divide, and how do you see bridging that? Part one being in American culture, society, among just Americans who aren't aware, and those of us who are aware, but also even within the bureaucracy between agencies like state and DoD. And then second question, unrelated, you talked about the staying power and not having the staying power in Afghanistan, but what would that have looked like? And I mean, even I would say ideally, it looks maybe like post-World War II, where the US is still in European nations, but as a partner, not as an occupier. Same in Korea. So is that what we should have envisioned? Is that what we were envisioning? We talk about regime change being, next to impossible in classes like Role of Force. So what do you think that should have looked like?
Sure. So I'm supposed to be brief on the first one. So I'll just say draft. Draft is my answer. I can expand on that. I think we should be really considering some type of mandatory national public service. I think that the U.S. military, I think there should be some conscripted element of the U.S. military. It's important to keep in mind that when we had a draft, it wasn't that 100% of the military was drafted. It was, it could be much lower. Imagine what it would look like if 5% of the U.S. military was conscripted. It's not so much the draft that matters, it's the prospect of a draft. The fact that every American household would have to enter into a lottery, and if you knew that you had a 1 in 20 chance of your son or daughter being forced to go conscripted when they turned 18 or 19, even though it was 1 in 20, you would be paying much closer attention to how we deployed our forces around the world. We wouldn't be having 20-year wars where no one was paying attention. And at that low percentage point, I think you would still retain the degree of professionalism that exists in the US military, and maybe avoid some of the problems that came out of the Vietnam era draft. But it's a much longer answer. With regards to Afghanistan, I actually think the model for Afghanistan is that, and again, the stories we tell ourselves about these wars really matter. So one of the things about the war on terror that was, I think, very complicated for us as Americans to get our minds around is that war began and it was predicated on preventing a negative, the negative being another terror attack on the United States. So we're sitting here, it's the year 2022, and I was just reminiscing with Professor Shultz that on 9/11, I parked my car 2 blocks over there in Hall of Flags. I remember it very well. If you told me on 9/12 that we would go more than 20 years without another significant terrorist attack in the United States, I think most people that morning would have been like, that's amazing. What a success. Now, obviously, the question is the cost, and it's coming at an enormous cost for us. But because the war was predicated on a negative, not allowing this negative outcome to occur, that was difficult. How do we know we're winning the war on terror? We know we're winning it when something doesn't happen. That's difficult for us. We understand wars where there's a positive outcome, like liberating all of Europe, the Second World War. It's such an earth story for Americans. So I would say what we did after 9/11 was we took the war on terror, which I would argue that we won while losing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were constructed as wars of liberation in the mold of the Second World War. So we told ourselves the wrong story and got into a lot of trouble. So what do I think maybe the right story would have been that we could have told ourselves? It was a parallel. I would say a place like Colombia. I mean, like Afghanistan, a narco war, we were 20 plus years in excess of that in Colombia at a very low boil that actually led to a positive outcome. So I think that is probably, not a direct analogy, but we shouldn't have been thinking in, we're going to liberate the Afghan people and democracy will flourish. We should have been thinking it's like, this is like Colombia. This is like a narco drug war. And we just got to dig in for the long haul here because it's in our backyard, even though Afghanistan's not our backyard. So that's how I would think about it.
Oh, maybe two more, then we'll call it a day.
Hi, my name is Tahili. I'm second year MO student. I'm studying the international security and civil resistance. My question is more related with your personal psychology about the maintain your evacuation team. Because last year for 3 months, I had the opportunity to volunteer the Afghan evacuation and resettlement team to save the lives of the Afghan faculty and interpreter staff and their families. And we realized that it's really hard to maintain the healthy and organized the work for the evacuation because we are getting every day we get the email from them about explaining about how chaos on that, but at the same time we are here, which is quite relatively peaceful. So I felt a lot of cognitive gap between that. So I was wondering, how did you deal with that issue with your teammates? It's kind of more structural issues. Thank you.
Sure. It's a great question. I think there's something psychologically that's very disorienting in sort of how this war ends because of the degree of connectivity that you have with people. So, at least my experience trying to get people out of Afghanistan, particularly in the month or so after Kabul fell, so the 2 weeks before the airport shut, and then a few weeks after we were trying to get flights out, was just that. How do knowing that you may or may not be able to help the person who's on the other end of the phone with you or on the other end of the WhatsApp chat with you, having never met these people before, but then having them send you desperate messages. And so I think that was tough because there's this knowledge that you just can't get you can't get everybody. Everyone's not going to get out who wants to get out. And if you're in that chain, knowing at a certain point you're just not going to answer that message. How do you not answer that message when someone's begging you for their life? How do you say, I'm too busy, or I'm turning my phone off? And I will say specifically for veterans, a lot. One of the things about, I think, these wars on terror is they've gone on so long. I left in 2011 and I sort of had to make my own peace. Like, hey, I've done this for 8 years. The war is over for me. I'm going to go live a different life. So I declared my own separate peace. And everyone I know who's fought in these wars, who's gotten out along the way, they've had to declare their separate peace. And like any peace treaty, as we all learned at the Fletcher School, some are more enduring than others. And I saw many of people I knew who had sort of made peace, their peace treaties sort of unravel around this. And suddenly they were back in the war. The psychology of the war had imposed itself on them again. I felt that way to a certain degree. I'm a big movie buff. In my family, the line I kept saying was from The Godfather 3, which was Michael Corleone says, just when I think I'm out, they pull me back in. And that's in that sense, I think so that it is difficult. So you talk about, your teammates. I think that that was something I experienced with people who, it was dredging up lots of old memories and something they thought they had escaped or thought was over for them now was not over for them, and having to reckon with that as well.
Veronica Furman, Master in Transatlantic Affairs. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned at the beginning, the negative effects of the timeframe setting by President Obama. Some of us just came back from a class taught by Professor Linnington on national security decision-making, and how the timeframe setting was also the negative effect that time frame setting had during the Dayton Accords, where you basically give a certain time frame for your enemy to understand that that's when the troops will withdraw, and you also have the negative impacts on the morale of the military, which usually operates towards an objective rather than an arbitrary time. And I was wondering what the logic behind setting timeframes in war is. Is it just domestic appeasement, or is there something else positive?
Well, it's complicated. Like these are not simple, questions, right? So on the one hand, you can make an argument very clearly that you should not set a time frame, because if you set a time frame, you're telegraphing to your adversary when you're going to leave, and all they have to do is wait you out. That's a fair argument. You can also make the argument that if you then set no time frame for your partner, you're saying we are never going to leave, so you will never have to do the work yourself. So you can just sort of kick up your heels, and we will keep carrying the weight for you. So you're never building out the type of capacity that you need. So what do? You're kind of like damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I think there's a balance that one needs to strike in order to do that the right way. I think you will note, for instance, if you were to juxtapose American involvement in Afghanistan versus American involvement in Ukraine, you'll note like we're not throwing out timelines in Ukraine right now. We're supporting them in their mission to get their country back, period. But I think there's also not the same fear. And we don't have our own troops in Ukraine, so that's obviously significant different. But there isn't the same fear that Ukrainians will then kick up their heels because we understand the dynamic of that war, which is they've proven a real capacity to fight. So each situation is different, and I think in Afghanistan it's obvious that we didn't get that balance right.
This will be our last question.
Okay, Dong Ho Shin, and I'm first year Mall, doing dual degree with a business school called HEC Paris. Actually, I served in the South Korea Navy as a public affairs officer, and you mentioned during the talk about military literacy, and I think it's crucial for politicians and military for different reasons, right? And for the military, I think the feeling that you're well supported is very important, and I think it strongly encourages why you exist. And I believe sometimes, in the military, tangible values are much more important than, tangible values. Anyway, my question was, as a veteran, it would be great if you share your thoughts on how to improve this military literacy and getting genuine support from the people. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for that question. And I think that kind of comes back a little what we were talking about, before about Vietnam veterans and the support that people have shown our generation of veterans, and the idea that amongst Americans veterans today, there might be more of a tendency to sort of, that sense of, I want to call it entitlement, but sort of that there is a almost like a dismissiveness that they can have towards civilians. So, one of the corrections from the Vietnam era, in which veterans were often looked at with suspicion or derision, was a really effusive praising of veterans. It's, if you're a veteran, if you're on active duty, as you all know, you can get on the airplane before the little old ladies. It's sort of, they're these weird, sort of quirky. It's almost like a secular Eucharist in our country to praise our veterans. We just sort of ominous dominus, like we do it.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you, and we do it. And I would say that one of the, although the spirit behind that I appreciate, and the corrective from Vietnam, I think is generally a good thing. I would say one of the offshoots is this sort of cynicism among veterans as time goes on, which is, yeah, we get thanked for our service. Yeah, everyone in the society does the secular Eucharist, but society then, fights a 20-year war, doesn't care about it. And when it comes time to abandon our allies, they dump it in our lap. So yeah, thank you for your service. Yeah, no thanks for that. And that to me, just when I look at kind of like society, I'm like, that's dangerous, because you don't want veterans or military members resenting the society they serve. And that kind of goes back to some of the political cross currents we're talking about this country. And again, the US military is not a monolith, but I have felt that current in the veterans community at times, and it's one that I wish we could dissipate. So how do you get rid of that? In my estimation, the way you get rid of it and increase military literacy and have a more healthy society vis-a-vis how we view our military is you force people to have skin in the game. And I think you would wind up fighting a lot fewer wars. I think coming out of these 20-year wars, one lesson I would say that's maybe unique is I think the American people should, going forward, be extremely skeptical of any politician that tells them they're going to go fight a war, but the cost will be very, very low. Don't worry about it. We shouldn't be fighting those wars. In my humble opinion, they're too damaging to our cohesion as a country.
This has been great.
Thank you.
This has really been great. And it's great to have you home.
Thank you.
I've probably given you these before.
I can always use a new one.
Well, I'm going to, first of all, did I ever give you the coin?
I don't know, you got the cool.
Okay, well, you get another one.
Thank you.
There you go. And you have the pullover. I remember actually, I had to have T-shirts made with our logo on for your dad.
Yeah.
For playing tennis.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is too warm to play tennis.
No, he wore through a lot of this.
So we got him T-shirts made, which is a great memory of your dad. Yeah, this is for you as well. You're always welcome here, and it's a great book. Your books make you think. It made me think, and draw parallels from other experiences. So thank you for that.
Nice, Dick. Thank you. Thank you all.